The storm rolled in fast. Thick, churning clouds swallowed the last hints of sunlight, casting the countryside into eerie darkness. Cold wind howled across the open fields, rustling brittle stalks of dry grass. The ground, once solid and steady, turned into a slushy mess of mud as rain lashed against the earth like 1,000 tiny whips. Through the storm, a single truck rumbled along a narrow dirt road, its headlights flickering against the relentless downpour. Inside, a man sat hunched over the steering wheel, his expression locked in a scowl. His knuckles turned white from gripping the leather too hard. The breeder. His name wasn't important. His reputation, however, was. For years, he had built his empire, breeding the strongest, fastest, most expensive horses anyone had ever seen. His horses won races, fetched fortunes, and turned heads in elite circles. He knew everything there was to know about winning bloodlines. And he knew when an animal wasn't worth his time. Which brought him to tonight. The truck skidded to a stop at the edge of a remote field. Beyond the fence, the land stretched into a lifeless, abandoned stretch of wilderness. The perfect place to get rid of a problem. The breeder climbed out, yanking the truck's rusty tailgate open. Inside stood 3 horses, young, weak, and trembling from the cold. Their ribs pressed against their dull coats, their eyes filled with confusion. They trusted him. That trust was a mistake. Useless, the breeder muttered under his breath, tightening his coat against the wind. He reached for the lead ropes, roughly pulling the horses toward the open field. One resisted, ears pinned back, nostrils flaring in protest. A spark of defiance. The breeder slapped the rope hard, sending a sharp jolt down the horse's neck. Don't fight it. You were never gonna be anything. One by one, he unhooked them. One by one, he shoved them forward. One by one, he turned his back. As the breeder walked back to the truck, the wind carried his voice into the storm. Survive if you can. The truck roared to life, red taillights disappearing into the night. And then, silence. Except, something moved in the darkness. A shadow detached from the tree-line, watching the abandoned creatures. Unblinking. Waiting. A whisper of movement. The horses flinched, ears swiveling in fear. Then the shadow took a step forward. A figure emerged. Not human. Not quite animal. Something else. It had been waiting for this moment. It had been watching. And now, the game had begun. The breeder didn't look back. He didn't feel a shred of guilt, not even a flicker of doubt. He had done what any smart businessman would do, cut his losses and moved on. The horses were weak. They lacked the refined genetics of champions. They wouldn't win races or impress buyers. They were a waste of space, money, and time. So, they were gone. Simple. As the rain hammered against the windshield, he focused on the road ahead. His estate was waiting for him, a vast stretch of land with pristine stables, finely bred stallions, and the best trainers money could buy. His horses were investments, nothing more. If they couldn't perform, they weren't worth feeding. He tightened his grip on the steering wheel. 1 year from now, he wouldn't even remember those 3 creatures. 1 year later. The breeder's world had crumbled. It started with one bad race. His prized stallion, one of the fastest he'd ever trained, came in second. A loss was unacceptable. He blamed the jockey, the weather, the track conditions, anything but himself. Then came the injuries. One by one, his best horses suffered strange setbacks. They pulled tendons, developed infections, lost muscle mass. Buyers started whispering, was the breeder losing his touch? Then the worst hit. A rival breeder emerged seemingly out of nowhere. His horses were unlike anything the industry had ever seen, stronger, faster, more intelligent. They didn't just win races, they dominated them. The breeder's phone stopped ringing. His sponsors pulled their funding. His best jockeys left for better offers. For the first time in his career, the breeder was irrelevant. He tried everything, new trainers, better feeding programs, expensive treatments, but nothing worked. His horses weren't enough anymore. And then came the rumor. A ridiculous, impossible rumor. People spoke of a new breed of horses. A legend whispered in stables, betting circles, and race tracks across the country. Creatures that defied logic. Some said they could run for miles without tiring. Others claimed they moved too fast for the human eye to track. Their intelligence was rumored to be near human level. The breeder scoffed. It was nonsense. A fairy tale. Until he saw one. The first encounter it happened at a private auction. He had attended out of habit, hoping to find a new investment, something that could restore his name. And then he saw it. A single horse. Its coat gleamed like polished obsidian, muscles rippling beneath the surface like coiled steel. Its stance was perfect, not just confident, but aware. And its eyes. Too sharp. Too knowing. It looked directly at him. Not like a horse recognizing an old owner. Not like an animal sizing up a human. No, it looked at him like it understood him. A deep, bone-chilling realization crept into the breeder's mind. This horse, this impossible creature. It was one of his. One of the worthless colts he had abandoned 1 year ago. His heart pounded in his chest. No. It couldn't be. But it was. Something had happened in that forgotten wilderness. Something had changed them. And now, they were back. And they were watching him. The breeder's breath hitched. He took a step back, his hands trembling. It had to be a coincidence, there was no way this was the same horse. No way. But deep down, he knew. The way it stood, the way its sharp, intelligent eyes locked onto him, it was as if the horse itself remembered. A cold sweat formed at the back of his neck. Someone had found them. Someone had taken the weak, worthless creatures he had abandoned and turned them into this. His mind raced. Who? How? Then, from the far side of the auction yard, he saw him. A man. Tall, with a quiet, unshakable presence. His face was weathered but strong, eyes dark with something unreadable. He didn't wear expensive suits like the wealthy buyers around him. Instead, he stood apart, calm, still, as if he already knew how this would end. And he was looking directly at the breeder. The realization hit like a punch to the gut. This was the man who had found them. This was the one who had changed them. The breeder clenched his fists, trying to steady his breathing. He didn't know who this stranger was, but one thing was certain, he had stolen what was rightfully his. The confrontation the breeder pushed through the crowd, approaching the man. "Hey," he barked. "Where did you get that horse?" The stranger didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned his gaze back to the creature standing beside him. He ran a hand down the horse's powerful neck, fingers tracing strange, almost ancient markings in its coat. Then, finally, he spoke. "You already know the answer." His voice was calm. Too calm. The breeder scowled. "That's my horse." A long pause. Then the man simply said, "No. It isn't." The words sent fire through the breeder's veins. "How much?" he snapped. "I don't care what it costs. Name your price." The stranger shook his head, amusement flickering in his eyes. "You think money can buy back what you threw away?" The breeder's patience cracked. "I don't know what kind of scam you're running, but I know that horse. I bred it. And I'll take it back, one way or another." For the first time, the stranger's expression darkened. You don't understand, do you? Then, with deliberate slowness, he stepped forward. They don't belong to you anymore. The breeder's breath caught. Something about the way he said it sent a chill down his spine. The man wasn't just talking about ownership. He was talking about something much bigger. What happened in the wild? The breeder clenched his jaw. Who are you? The man smiled slightly. You wouldn't believe me if I told you. Try me. The stranger studied him for a moment, then said, I found them the night you left them to die. His voice held no anger, no accusation, just fact. They were weak. Starving. But they had something rare. Something you never saw. The breeder frowned. And what's that? The stranger's gaze sharpened. The will to survive. A pause. Then the man continued. You thought they were broken. But you never understood them. You never saw what they could become. He ran his hand over the horse's neck again, and the creature responded in a way no ordinary animal should. The horse tilted its head, not just reacting, but thinking. It understood the conversation. It understood the breeder. The breeder swallowed hard. What did you do to them? The stranger didn't blink. I didn't do anything. They changed on their own. Something cold settled in the breeder's stomach. That's impossible. The man's smile didn't fade. Is it? For the first time, the breeder felt afraid. Not of the stranger. Not even of the horse. But of the truth. Something had happened in that wilderness. Something beyond breeding. Beyond training. And now, they were back. And they were watching him. The breeder couldn't sleep that night. He sat in the dim light of his study, his mind spinning. The image of that horse, his horse, standing beside that stranger refused to leave him. Something had changed. Something unnatural. He pulled out old records, flipping through the files of every horse he had bred. The markings, the lineage, the bloodlines, all of it confirmed what he already knew. That horse was one of the 3 he had abandoned a year ago. But there was no explanation for what it had become. It wasn't just healthier. It was something else entirely. Faster. Smarter. More than a horse should be. A desperate search for answers. The breeder's pride had taken a hit, but his instincts told him something bigger was at play. He needed to know who that man was and what had happened to those animals. By the next morning, he was on the road, retracing his steps from a year ago. The place where he had abandoned the horses was just as he remembered, a forgotten stretch of land, wild and untouched. No stables, no ranches, no reason for anyone to be here. And yet, someone had been. Tracks. Not just horse tracks. Something more. Strange patterns in the dirt. Symbols carved into trees. Marks that didn't belong to any known training method. His gut twisted. This wasn't just a random rescue. Whoever had taken them had done something far beyond normal training. The first signs of the impossible. Then he saw the first sign of something unnatural. A deep groove in the earth, stretching for nearly 50 yards. He crouched down, running his fingers through the dirt. It wasn't just a mark from hooves, it was like the ground itself had been torn apart. By force. By something powerful. A chill crept up his spine. Then, he heard it. A distant sound, something between a low thunderclap and a whisper. He turned. The trees in the distance moved, not with the wind, but with purpose. Something was out there. And then, a shadow passed between the trees. The breeder froze. It wasn't a man. And it wasn't a horse. It was something in between. The hidden guardian. A voice cut through the silence. You shouldn't be here. The breeder spun around. The stranger from the auction stood behind him, watching. His presence was just as unnerving as before, calm, unreadable. But this time, there was something different in his eyes. A warning. "You don't understand what you've done," the man said. The breeder stepped forward. "I want my horses back." The stranger shook his head. "They aren't yours anymore." Something moved in the shadows behind him. The breeder caught a glimpse, muscles shifting, eyes gleaming in the dark. "They were never just horses," the stranger continued. "You bred them, yes. But you never saw their potential. You abandoned them because they didn't meet your standards." The breeder's jaw tightened. "And what did you do to them?" The stranger tilted his head. "I didn't do anything," he said. "They evolved." The power within the trees rustled again, and then he saw them. All 3 horses, but they weren't the same creatures he had left behind. Their coats gleamed unnaturally, their muscles moved with precision too perfect, too controlled. Their eyes weren't the eyes of animals anymore. They were aware. The breeder's mouth went dry. What are they?" The stranger exhaled slowly. "Survivors." The horses stepped forward, their movements too synchronized, too deliberate. The breeder had seen thousands of horses in his lifetime, trained them, bred them, but never had he seen animals move like this. It wasn't instinct. It was intelligence. And then, one of them spoke. Not with words, but with its eyes. The breeder stumbled back. This wasn't just a rescue. This wasn't just a second chance. Something had changed in these creatures. And whatever they had become was no longer just horse. The breeder's breath came fast and shallow. His hands trembled at his sides. He had been around horses his entire life, had trained and sold champions, but never had he felt like prey before. The 3 creatures stood before him, their bodies powerful and precise, their eyes sharp with something far beyond animal instinct. They watched him. Not like horses looking at a man, but like equals assessing a former enemy. His throat was dry. "This is impossible." The stranger beside him folded his arms. "Only to you." The breeder turned to him, eyes narrowing. "What did you do to them?" The man tilted his head slightly. "You're still asking the wrong question." A challenge of will. The breeder took a step closer, trying to mask his unease. "These animals are mine. I bred them." "You had no right." A low snort from the largest of the 3 cut him off. The sound was deliberate. Not just a random reaction, but a response. A warning. A realization crept into the breeder's mind, these horses were listening. They weren't just standing there. They were following the conversation. And they understood. His stomach twisted. This isn't possible. No animal can think like this. The stranger exhaled, as if disappointed. "You still don't see it." "See what?" The man gestured toward the 3 creatures. They were never just horses. The breeder clenched his fists. "I don't believe in fairy tales." The stranger smiled faintly. "You should." A silent conversation. The largest of the 3 took a step forward. Its hooves pressed against the earth with a deliberate precision, as if each movement was measured, controlled. Then it lowered its head. Not in submission. In acknowledgement. The breeder felt his stomach drop. Then the impossible happened. The horse locked eyes with him, and he felt something shift in his mind. A whisper. A feeling, not words, not speech, but understanding. It was looking into him. And it knew him. Every cruelty. Every failure. Every selfish thought he had ever had about them. It remembered. It never forgot. The breeder staggered back, gasping. What is this?" The stranger remained still. "A second chance." A forgotten history. The breeder shook his head. No. This is some trick. Some training method. You're hiding something. The stranger studied him carefully. Then, for the first time, he said, "They're not from here." A silence fell over them. The wind stirred the trees. The horses remained still, waiting. The breeder frowned. What? The stranger's expression darkened. You bred them, yes. But you never understood what they were. You saw failure where there was potential. You dismissed them before they had a chance to show you the truth. The breeder swallowed. What truth? The man turned, staring at the sky as if searching for something far beyond this world. They are the last of something old. Something nearly forgotten. More than just horses. The breeder's heartbeat pounded in his ears. That's ridiculous. Is it? The stranger gestured toward the three creatures. Look at them. Do they look like normal horses to you? The breeder's gaze traveled over them again, the unnatural grace, the impossible awareness, the sheer presence that sent an instinctual chill down his spine. No. No, they didn't. They were waiting for something, the stranger continued. Something to awaken inside them. And you abandoning them? That was the final test. The breeder's breath hitched. What are you saying? The stranger turned back to him, his expression unreadable. I'm saying, he said slowly, that you gave them exactly what they needed to become what they were always meant to be. The words sent a chill through the breeder's core. He had abandoned them. Left them to die. And in doing so, he had set something into motion that he could no longer control. And now, they were back. Not for revenge. For something far greater. The breeder's heart pounded as the stranger's words settled over him like a storm cloud. You gave them exactly what they needed to become what they were always meant to be. It didn't make sense. Nothing about this made sense. Yet, standing here, staring into the too intelligent eyes of the creatures he had once discarded, he couldn't deny it, something had changed. They weren't just stronger. They weren't just faster. They were something else entirely. The breeder's denial, no, the breeder shook his head. This is ridiculous. Horses don't just evolve overnight. You're lying. The stranger gave him a long, unreadable look. Then he simply turned to the three creatures. Show him. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the air shifted. The ground beneath them seemed to hum, an invisible energy rippling through the earth. The horses moved, not like animals, but like something precise, something controlled. And then, they ran. Not in the way the breeder had seen 1,000 times before. They disappeared. One moment, they were there. The next, they were across the clearing, standing 100 yards away before the dust had even settled. The breeder staggered back, his pulse hammering. What? The stranger simply nodded. The creatures trotted back, unbothered, effortless. You trained horses for years. Tell me, have you ever seen anything move like that? The breeder swallowed hard. No. Never. But that wasn't all. The movement wasn't just speed. It was calculated. As if they had thought about where to land, how to cut through the air. As if they knew something the rest of the world didn't. The truth about their origins. The breeder turned to the stranger, voice hoarse. What are they? The man exhaled. A forgotten breed. One that was never meant to be found. The breeder narrowed his eyes. What does that mean? The stranger didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached into his coat and pulled out something old and weathered. A journal. He held it out. The breeder hesitated before snatching it up, flipping through the pages. At first, it looked like old breeder records, but they weren't in any language he recognized. Strange symbols. Ancient sketches of creatures that looked like horses, but weren't. His breath caught. The same markings that ran along the black stallion's coat. The same unnatural stance, the sharp, knowing eyes. His throat was dry. This isn't real. The stranger's gaze darkened. It's as real as the mistake you made a year ago. The breeder's hands trembled over the page. He forced himself to read further, but the more he read, the less he understood. Mentions of creatures bred for war, survival, intelligence. Not just for speed. For something greater. They were never just horses, the stranger said. Not really. A forgotten bloodline, the breeder's mind raced. You're saying. I bred them. I created them. But I didn't even know what I had. The stranger nodded. And when you abandoned them, you gave them the one thing they never had before. The breeder's voice was barely a whisper. What? The stranger's expression was both grim and knowing. Freedom. A cold chill ran through the breeder. They were meant to be controlled. That's how they were designed, long ago. But when you left them, they had no choice but to awaken on their own. The breeder's legs felt weak. He had discarded them, and in doing so, he had set them free. Free to become something else. Something even their creators had never intended. The breeder's last attempt, no, the breeder squared his shoulders. I don't believe it. This is insane. I don't care what kind of tricks you've taught them, they are still my horses. He turned, forcing confidence back into his voice. And I'm taking them back. The black stallion stared at him. It was the first time the creature had truly acknowledged him. Not like an owner. Not like a master. But like an equal. And then, it made a choice. It stepped back. Away from him. The other two followed. The breeder's gut twisted. No, he took a step forward, anger surging. You belong to me. The stallion's head tilted, not in fear. Not in defiance. But in understanding. And then, it turned away. The breeder's stomach dropped. It was rejecting him. Not as an owner. As a human. The stranger spoke softly. You don't get to take them back. They made their choice. The words stung deeper than the breeder could have ever imagined. For the first time in his life, he had been truly dismissed. Not by people. Not by the industry. By the very creatures he had thought beneath him. The final warning, the stranger turned to leave, the horses following him. The breeder's hands curled into fists. This isn't over. The man paused. Over his shoulder, he said one last thing, I suggest you stop looking for them. A heavy silence fell. Then, in the blink of an eye, they were gone. The breeder's realization, the breeder stood frozen, his heart pounding. For the first time in his life, he felt small. Not in power. Not in wealth. But in understanding. These weren't just horses. They were something more. And whatever they were becoming. The world wasn't ready for them. The breeder stood frozen, staring at the empty space where the stranger and the three impossible creatures had disappeared. The wind howled through the abandoned land, but it wasn't the cold that made him shudder. It was fear. Not fear of the man. Not fear of the horses. Fear of what he had lost. For the first time in his life, something was taken from him, not by force, not by deception, but by choice. And that choice hadn't been his. A man without power back at his estate, the breeder poured himself a drink, his hands still trembling. He had spent years building an empire. His name carried weight. But now? He was nothing. His horses had failed. His reputation had crumbled. The industry had moved on without him. And then, there was the legend. Stories of impossible creatures had begun to spread. The black stallion and its companions were spoken of in hushed whispers, stories of their unbelievable speed, intelligence, and presence. Ranchers and trainers dismissed them as myths. Scientists had no evidence to believe them. But the breeder knew the truth. Because he had seen them with his own eyes. And he would not be forgotten. He downed his drink, setting the glass down hard. If I can't own them, he muttered to himself, then no one can. A reckless hunt begins determined, the breeder hired trackers. People who specialized in finding things that didn't want to be found. He offered money, resources, anything to locate those creatures again. At first, the search was slow. They left no tracks, no trails. It was as if they had vanished completely. But then, one of the trackers came back with a lead. A remote valley. A place untouched by human hands. Where whispers spoke of something watching from the trees. The forbidden land. The breeder arrived at the valley just before sunset. The air was thick with something unexplainable. A strange hum, a tension in the atmosphere that made his skin prickle. And then, he saw them. They stood at the far side of the clearing. All three. Waiting. But something was different this time. Their bodies had changed again. Sleeker. Stronger. Their movements even more controlled, more precise. They weren't just animals anymore. They were becoming something else. And this time, they weren't alone. The arrival of the others from the shadows, more figures emerged. Not just 3. 6. 7. More. All like them, impossibly strong, impossibly intelligent. The breeder's breath caught in his throat. There are more of them. He had spent his life believing he controlled the best bloodlines, that he bred the finest creatures. But now? The world had left him behind. And the horses, the ones he had once called worthless, had found their own kind. They had chosen to evolve. And they no longer needed him. The final warning. A figure stepped forward, the stranger. He looked at the breeder with neither anger nor hatred. Just understanding. You shouldn't have come here. The breeder swallowed. They're mine. The man sighed, shaking his head. You still don't get it. He turned to the black stallion, who watched the breeder with something almost human in its gaze. They gave you a chance, the stranger said. And you threw it away. The stallion took a single step forward. The ground rippled beneath its hooves. The breeder's chest tightened. The very air around him seemed to shift, to bend. And then he understood. He had not come to reclaim them. He had come to witness what he could never control. The beginning of something new. A final act of defiance. No, the breeder whispered, shaking his head. I made you. I own you. The stallion stopped. Then, it lowered its head. A choice. A silent message. You abandoned us. And we moved on. The breeder's hands curled into fists. He had never been refused before. Never been looked at like he was nothing. He took a step forward. And then, the stallion turned away. The others followed. One by one, they disappeared into the valley. Leaving him behind. Leaving him forgotten. The stranger gave the breeder one last look. Don't follow us again. Then, he too was gone. The breeder's breaking point. For a long time, the breeder just stood there. Alone. The wind carried whispers through the trees, but they were not meant for him. They had never been meant for him. His empire had crumbled. His legacy had vanished into the wilderness. And now? Now, he was nothing. But somewhere, deep in the valley, something new was rising. Something beyond human understanding. And the world was not ready for it. The breeder stood alone in the fading light, his body tense, his mind in chaos. The valley was silent now. The creatures, the very ones he had discarded, had turned their backs on him. Not with hatred. Not with defiance. With indifference. That was what stung the most. For his entire life, he had been someone, a name that held weight, a man who controlled bloodlines and built champions. Now, he didn't matter. The creatures had outgrown him. They had moved on. The last desperate gamble, but the breeder wasn't done yet. His pride wouldn't let him walk away empty-handed. His reputation was already in ruins, this was the only thing left that could make him matter again. So he made a choice. He would capture them. If he couldn't reclaim them, if he couldn't convince them, then he would force them back. That night, under the cover of darkness, he called in the best handlers money could buy. Trappers. Wranglers. Experts who specialized in bringing down the wild and the untamed. He gave them one order. Bring them back. The hunt begins. They moved at dawn. Armed with high-tech nets, tranquilizers, and the best tracking equipment available, the team ventured into the valley. The breeder followed behind, staying at a distance. His heart pounded, not with fear, but with anticipation. He would not leave empty-handed. He would bring them back, prove to the world that they were still his. That he was still in control. But deep down, a whisper of doubt crept in. You don't control them anymore. A fatal mistake. The handlers moved carefully, surrounding the valley, laying their traps. They found signs of movement, hoofprints, disturbed foliage, lingering energy that made their instruments flicker. They knew something was here. But the creatures. They were nowhere to be found. It was as if the valley itself was watching, waiting. And then, everything went wrong. A loud crackle split the air as the first net was fired. The moment it touched the ground, the valley reacted. The trees trembled. The earth beneath them rumbled. And then, the creatures appeared. But they weren't running. They weren't afraid. They were waiting. Watching. Prepared. The unstoppable force. The handlers hesitated. Their training had prepared them for wild horses, for animals that relied on instinct and could be manipulated with force. But these weren't wild horses. They were something else. Something new. The black stallion took a single step forward. And in an instant, everything changed. The air shifted. A pressure unlike anything the handlers had ever felt pushed against their chests, forcing them backward. The valley itself seemed to bend and twist. Then, they moved. Faster than the eye could follow. Before the first handler could react, his tranquilizer gun was gone. Torn from his grasp, crushed beneath a hoof that had been nowhere near him a second ago. Another tried to fire a net, but the wind caught it, sending it spiraling backward. And then, silence. The handlers looked at each other, realization setting in. They are toying with us. They are stronger than us. They are smarter than us. And they are not ours to take. The breeder's moment of truth. The black stallion turned, its gaze locking onto him. For the first time, the breeder felt truly powerless. Not because he was outnumbered. Not because he was outmatched. But because for the first time in his life, he had no control. The stallion stepped closer, its presence overwhelming. The breeder couldn't move. Couldn't speak. Then, he heard it. Not with his ears. But in his mind. A single, undeniable message. Let go. The breeder staggered back, gasping. His chest tightened, his vision blurred. He clutched his head, shaking. No, no, I can fix this. But deep down, he knew. He had already lost. The stallion didn't gloat. Didn't punish him. Didn't hurt him. It simply turned away. The other creatures followed. One by one, they disappeared into the valley, leaving the breeder behind. The end of the chase, the handlers ran. They didn't care about the money anymore. Some things weren't meant to be hunted. Some things were beyond human reach. The breeder fell to his knees, his hands shaking. He had spent his life trying to create the perfect creatures. And when they had finally become something greater than he had ever dreamed, they had chosen a world without him. For the first time in his life, he had no legacy. No bloodline to pass down. Nothing to leave behind. Only the memory of what he had given up. And the knowledge that he would never see them again. The final departure far in the distance, hidden deep within the valley, the creatures gathered. The stranger stood beside them, watching the sunrise. He knew this was only the beginning. The world wasn't ready for them. Not yet. But one day, it would be. And when that day came, the world would finally understand what it had ignored for so long. The future had already begun. And it no longer belonged to man. The breeder sat motionless, his knees pressed into the dirt. The valley stretched before him, empty now, the creatures gone. Gone for good. His hands trembled, not from fear, but from realization. For the first time in his life, he had lost something that money, power, and influence could never bring back. And the worst part? He had done it to himself. A life without purpose. Days passed. Then weeks. The breeder returned to his estate, but it felt different now. The stables, once filled with champions, felt empty. Lifeless. The horses that remained were nothing like the ones he had chased into the valley. No sharp intelligence in their eyes. No hidden strength waiting to be unleashed. They were just horses. And for the first time, the breeder realized that wasn't enough anymore. He had spent his life breeding creatures for others to own. Training them to win, selling them to the highest bidder, discarding those that didn't meet his standards. But now, he understood. True value was never in ownership. It was in freedom. An unexpected message one night, as he sat alone in his study, a package arrived. No sender. No note. Just a single item inside. An old leather-bound journal. His breath hitched. It was the same journal the stranger had shown him in the valley. The one filled with ancient sketches and forgotten knowledge. Why send it to him? He turned the first page. A single handwritten sentence stared back at him. What you lost was never yours to keep. But what you learn from it can still matter. The breeder's throat tightened. He flipped through the pages, the old symbols and notes making little sense at first. But the more he studied, the clearer it became. This wasn't just a record. It was a blueprint. A guide to something bigger than racing. Bigger than breeding. Something that had been forgotten by man long ago. Something that had never been meant to belong to anyone. And now, it was in his hands. A choice to make. For the first time in his life, the breeder faced a question he didn't know how to answer. Did he walk away? Forget everything he had seen and live out the rest of his years in regret? Or did he change? Not for power. Not for wealth. But to understand. To learn. To finally see the creatures for what they were meant to be. The true meaning of worth. The next morning, the breeder did something he never thought he would do. He stepped into his stables, looked at the horses he had left, and for the first time, he didn't see investments. He saw potential. Not in how much money they could bring him. Not in how fast they could run. But in what they could become if given the chance. The way he had never given those three creatures a chance before. The final realization he would never see them again. The black stallion. The others. They had moved beyond him. But their lesson would remain. Because in the end, they were never truly his. And that was why they had become greater than anything he had ever bred before. Not because of what he had given them, but because of what he had denied them. Freedom. And in that freedom, they had become something the world would never forget. The last words as he placed the journal back on his desk, a final thought entered his mind. If you measure something only by what it can give you, you will never see its true worth. He finally understood. And for the first time in his life, the breeder let go. Of control. Of greed. Of the past. And as the sun rose over his land, he swore he would never make the same mistake again. Because the greatest creatures he had ever created had never belonged to him at all.